Hello, and welcome to the Good News from the Corner podcast. I'm Jay. I'm your podcast host, and I'm also the rector at St. John's Episcopal Church in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm glad you found us. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned for sermons, lectures, and more good news from the corner of Central and Greer. Okay, I'm Jay Biedenhorn. I'm glad you're here. This is a bonus episode of our podcast, Good News from the Corner. I'm sitting here with Caroline Carrico, and I want to say two things, a word of gratitude. Caroline is sort of the maestro. She's the person behind the curtain who makes this thing run, so thank you for that. And also, welcome, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity to sit down and chat for a few minutes about your presentation on Constance and her companions, the Martyrs of Memphis, which you presented this past Sunday at St. John's. If you were listening, start there first. This is a follow-up. Come back because Caroline's a thoughtful and engaging person. So come back, but start with the presentation from last week. So welcome and thank you. And I want to know, talk to me about what you have discovered and how you discover it, right? I mean, Constance and her companions, if you know the story, start there. Give me the elevator speech. If somebody talks about Constance and her companions, what's the story?
The story that most people pick up on is that they were a group of Episcopal nuns who were in Memphis during the 1878 yellow fever epidemic. My slightly longer elevator pitch is that they came in 1873. So they were here for nursed through one yellow fever season and came back and nursed through a second one. Several people who were connected with it died and are now saints in the Episcopal Church. So that's kind of the very short version. For the much longer version, you can listen to my talk from last week.
Which I would encourage you to do because it was thoughtfully done and well researched. Yeah, so if you don't know that, that's probably an interesting point to bring up. There are saints in the Episcopal Church, right?
There are religious orders in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, right. People don't even necessarily know that. There are, in fact, religious orders in the Episcopal Church, and the sisters were, and I would love to hear more about that because you've done a bunch of research. The sisters were sisters of which order?
So they were the Community of St. Mary's out of New York. And they came, Memphis was the second installation of the sisterhood. So they came from New York to Memphis in 1873 to open up St. Mary's School.
Okay.
And while they were trying to get the school set up, a yellow fever epidemic broke out. So they had to delay setting up the school, and instead, even though they were all trained teachers, not trained nurses, they all learned on the job and became nurses during the yellow fever epidemic.
So that was new to me. I tend to think about yellow fever, and I if I had known before, I had forgotten that their original purpose was coming to Memphis for education. And I'm curious about that because if they could have the courage to respond to something like this without medical training, right? If they're just normal people, they don't have degrees and all the things that puts a little more pressure on me to act in a loving and Christ-like way. Right?
Well, and I think that's one of the most interesting parts of their story to me is I think sometimes there's a tendency to think of historical actors in general and saints in particular as somehow other, like they're not
100%.
And so I think it's one of the challenges as a historian is to connect people in the present to people of the past, and remembering that there's a lot about humans that are the same no matter when we live. We have our own internal motivations and emotions and desires and reasons for doing things that are not so different from how we feel.
Yeah.
So the circumstances of their lives were different, but they didn't have indoor plumbing, but they could still smell like we can smell, right?
Sure,
like they could be inconvenienced by that the same way we would be inconvenienced by not having a toilet.
Yeah, right. Some things are just don't work, no matter when or where you're living.
And now that's referencing my whole long aside about Memphis' sanitary conditions in 1870.
Right.
I was wondering when my brain went there. That's why my brain went there.
well, you use the word in your talk, filthy.
Filthy,
right?
yes. It was gross.
And so, I think you're absolutely right, Caroline. When we talk about saints, we're probably thinking about sort of cartoon characters with little halos around their head who are perfect. And to think about saints in that way, where we're not fully realizing their humanity, right? That Constance and Thecla and the others would have been aware of the smells on the ground in Memphis in the summer in 1878, right? They were people like you and me, and I don't know. In some ways, to put the saints on a pedestal like that sort of absolves us of our responsibility, right? We say, well, we can't possibly be saints, so we're not going to do anything, or we're going to sort of hedge our bets a little bit, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I actually have I think you said almost that exact same thing the first time I told you about my project, because I have it written down in my notes.
Interesting.
From when we talked about it a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Something about how we can distance ourselves. Yeah. Well, I guess
it stuck with me.
Well, I guess me too, right? If I said it again, I repeat myself a lot. I think more. It's
a good rhetorical device,
isn't it? Though. So, you found lots of primary information, which is just Caroline studied history in college, you said, and I did as well, and I so admire somebody that can actually go and find this stuff, right? I just if it's not on a computer, I don't really know how to do it. But Caroline went and engaged with these original materials and found, I don't know, lots that sort of made these people come alive and not just figures on a page in a book. Does that? I don't know if you meant to do that or if that sort of came out of you. I don't know.
This is the intention.
Okay, so well, good. Success.
Thank you. So I've specialized in American history, but my real area of focus is public history, which is basically history outside of an academic setting. So it's taking the same level of rigor that you would take into any academic paper, but the end product is something that's intended for a public audience. And so in my past, that's been as museum exhibits, but I'm also as a writer and podcaster sometimes. So, and I found that the most effective way to bring the past to life for people is when it's done through stories, and it's done through making, like we were talking about, making people three-dimensional and reminding people of...
That's such a lovely image, right? To think about a person rising up off the page into a three-dimensional person.
Yeah. So, it took me on a really long... And it'll give me interesting questions. So I think all good research projects start with questions, not with answers. I have a professor friend who always says doing history backwards is bad business. So we don't start with the interpretation and go back to find the facts that suit it. You start with the question, and then ask those questions of all the sources until you get to an interpretation.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I might have lost sight of the question.
No, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that's if you intended to do it, you were effective. So, Caroline, I know you. I know you from St. John's. I know that you're a practicing Christian. Talk to me a little bit about these. We spend a lot of time talking about the women of the order, but the martyrs of Memphis. These real people who stayed and in some cases went against the flow, the exodus out of the city, and came back to this city that was suffering so much. What is the sort of academic research and your faith? How have those two things informed each other with this project?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. That's a tricky one. Because they both are happening at the same time, right? Because I'm one person doing it. So, I'll walk you through my research process.
I love it. Yeah.
Plug it
in. I want to hear it.
So, I forgot that we got cut off.
That's
at
okay.
that point last time. So, I started off like I do with all projects, which is with us reading as much secondary material that I can find. The two books that deal with Memphis that were written recently were American Plague by Molly Crosby.
Correct.
And then Fever Season by Jeanette Keith. And Fever Season deals with Memphis very specifically in a whole lot of detail. And American Plague is more of a history of the disease itself, the virus itself. But there's a large focus on Memphis and on
Which
yellow
you told
fever.
us on Sunday, there's still not a yellow fever cure, right?
There's
you can
not
treat
a cure.
the symptoms.
Right.
But
there's a vaccine and you can treat the symptoms, but there's no cure. And many people get yellow fever every year in tropical areas near the equator.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you started with these secondary books.
Yeah, to start with them, and then did like all good historians do, and went through all the footnotes and all the works cited to come up with another list of reading. And from there, I got more information about the sisterhood. So there's a book called 10 Decades of Praise, and quick plug for the St. John's Library. There's a copy
We
in
got
there.
it.
The book's out of print, so if you want it, and you don't want to buy it online like I did,
We got it.
it's in the St. John's Library.
Come see us.
And there's a whole section of that that's about Memphis. And what I realized in that was that the sister who wrote it several decades ago was quoting letters. So I knew that at least at some point those letters existed. And the community of St. Mary's has undergone a very interesting transition where the sisters who are in Sewanee are the community of St. Mary's as it was then. The community in New York is actually a different religious community now, so they're not connected anymore.
How about that?
Yeah. So before I went off trying to, because obviously we're based in Memphis, and the Archives of the Order, to the best of my knowledge, would be in New York. I was trying to figure out what I could do closer to home. And so
Sure.
I talked to Wayne Dowdy and all my archivist friends at the Memphis Public Library, where I've spent lots and lots of time, and they helped me find the information that they have. And they have a book that Sewanee put out several years ago that's copies or the transcriptions of Bishop Quintard's letters that he wrote during the yellow fever, and a lot of them were to Sister Huetta. And so there's this whole side story of trying to get some children out of Memphis and to Sewanee that Sister Huetta was involved in, that I did not go into because it gets really complicated.
Yeah, kind of beyond the purview of this topic.
Yes.
Right?
So he's got a perspective as the Bishop of Tennessee, who's not in Memphis while this terrible thing is happening. He's trying to get priests there. He's trying to make sure the sisters have what they need, and he's not even in Sewanee for all this time. He's traveling too. So
One diocese at that time, he's all over the state.
and he was going. He was traveling other places too. Like I think he was in the Northeast at one point during
Sure.
all of this, and so that's all tracked out there, with the advantage that I didn't have to try to decipher handwriting because someone had already done it.
Okay,
Right,
I didn't even think about that.
Yes, it's a fun skill of the historian is deciphering
Handwriting.
Yeah, some people are much better than others.
But if you go to someone who's already transcribed that,
It makes it go a whole lot faster. And so then I was talking to Miranda Cully, who
Yeah,
used to be the
of course.
associate rector here.
of course.
And at that point, she was at St. Mary's School as a chaplain.
That's right.
And so she introduced me to a woman there who used to be the head of school, who now volunteers in their archives. And she set up a meeting, so I went over there one day, and I wasn't really expecting much, which was a mistake, because when I sat down, she handed me this manila folder and goes, "This is all we have." And I opened it up, and it was they're typewritten, like on a typewriter, transcripts of the original letters both from Memphis to New York and some from New York to Memphis. So it's this record,
Unbelievable.
and it's just in a filing cabinet at St. Mary's.
All these 150 years later.
Yeah, and they're, again, transcribed. Someone had taken the time to transcribe them, and whoever did it had also made notes in the margin, so there was marginalia that I could follow that also gave it more context.
So that's like the mother lode right here in Memphis.
Yes, which just goes back to my whole being willing to admit what you don't know and ask for help is critical, I think, as both historians and Christians for...
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this whole time reading it, it's really interesting because along the way I had to learn a lot about Episcopal Church history, because you loaned me a book about the history of the Episcopal
That's
Church
right.
that got
Yep.
me started.
I remember that now.
And answered a lot of questions about, like, what's high church, what does low church mean?
Yeah, we were talking, you were curious at that point about just the sort of the development of different schools of churchmanship.
Yeah, so I felt like there was a whole lot of background that I needed just to get to this point where I could start to think of these women and men as full people to understand the context of when and where they lived.
That's right.
And that doesn't just mean where they were physically, but where they were in terms of the Episcopal Church. Like, how did they fit into the church? And the answer was not particularly well. They didn't really fit. They were a little different.
Well, and we've talked before. I don't know how widely people know about religious orders in the Episcopal Church, right? And so, I mean, I don't think I'm the only person. When you think about a nun, you assume Roman Catholic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would imagine these people were from the sort of are they sort of higher church, more kind of lean more Catholic in their thinking?
Yes.
And in a time when that was not as
more high church as well. So he was the Oxford movement,
right?
So that was part of the reason why he was so keen to bring them to Memphis. In addition to the fact that he knew Mother Harriet from when they were kids. So there's all these levels. They
grew up together. You say in your talk.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's.
She called him Charlie.
Charlie, not Bishop, anybody. Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the most helpful questions I think that you raise, and it's as you've just said, you start with questions rather than presumptions and then work backward. You asked this question at the beginning of your talk: what is a martyr? And I think, to the extent that we consider that, I can only speak for myself. I tend to think about them as people who are who die for the faith.
I think
right?
Like people who are like actively killed because they were killed because they were Christians.
Yeah, right. Like someone's beheaded.
Yeah.
For the faith in the early 2nd century, or
which I think again puts martyrdom like way beyond what we can consider today. It puts it so far in the past.
That's a fine point. Yeah. Martyrdom is a historical reality, right?
Or something that's got a very specific geographical reality today.
Right.
Like in Memphis, we're not likely to be asked to renounce our faith, or we'll be killed.
Right. So right. I would hope not. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not.
No, but
that's not our reality.
No. It's a reality for some persecuted Christians, but it's not really.
But not for the people at the corner of Central and Greer.
Yeah, right. No, we have Christianity's legal, and so we have like little children in the church, and it's loud and chaotic because there's a lot of life here, and there's no one at risk by being there. But I think you in your talk, so you start with this question: what is a martyr? And I think that you answer it in a really interesting way. And so, if you would allow me, I would like to read back to you your final movement of your paper. And if there is some sort of paraphrase or word switch, I beg pardon. But this is, I think, how you answer the question. The martyrs of Memphis went into the 1878 yellow fever epidemic with a clear understanding of what they were going to face. Some of them had nursed yellow fever patients before, and the ones who had not had heard the stories. Further, you say, when things got bad, they did not leave. They were constantly pushed to do new and hard things. They lost their ability to practice their faith in a church, and instead were practicing it in the world. They experienced their faith through their group and individual suffering, and I think they embodied loving kindness, actively considering and connecting to others in their time of distress. So I believe that these men and women are martyrs because of their actions, not because of how they died. That challenges my understanding of martyrdom, and say more about that. I mean, it's such a lovely place to wind up in a talk about Constance and her companions.
So when I started doing this, the Saints' Day is Constance and her companions, and then it always says the Martyrs of Memphis after that.
Right.
And so I realized that maybe I didn't understand what a martyr was, if my understanding of it was people who were killed because of their faith, because they weren't. They weren't killed because they were Christians. And so I went to the Episcopal Church's online dictionary, and the Episcopal Church defines martyr as people who are witness to their faith by their suffering, I kind of mentally added the or, who are persecuted to death for their faith.
Right.
But they're not both a requirement to be a martyr.
That's right.
And so the fact that they were suffering, they weren't, like, their ability to practice their faith according to their rule and the way that they took their vows and decided to do this. Part of it was taking communion every day. Part of it was living in community with each other. And they couldn't all live in community with each other. They were spread out around the city doing different tasks. Both of the priests died, so they didn't have a priest for a while. And their ability to practice their faith the way that they anticipated that they always would, that they always planned to, was taken away, but it didn't stop them from still doing what needed to be done.
Right.
And I think that's what makes them martyrs. They could have left. No one would have blamed them.
Many people did.
Lots of people did. And so no one would have blamed them for leaving. But they chose not to.
Right.
And they suffered for it. Even the ones who didn't die still suffered. The people they cared deeply about and lived with and had made a life with died.
That's right.
So there's huge amounts of suffering. And so I think that willingness to keep practicing their faith in a very active, very public, and yet personal way,
right,
is what's at the center of their story.
I think it's at the center of the Christian story, right? I mean, my sense is we're probably hardwired to avoid suffering, right? I mean,
it seems like a pretty natural human inclination.
Yeah, right. I mean, we fight tooth and nail to avoid suffering, but I think you help us to see that it is in fact in the suffering, both in their own suffering. I mean, as you say, they knew people who died. Some of them died themselves, but also to be present with the suffering of the orphan children and those who were sick and dying. To be present with their suffering is, I think, it's at the core of being a follower. And I'm just so taken with the idea that it's not practicing the faith, being a martyr, bearing witness. Perhaps it could call for my very life, but if it doesn't, I'm not excluded from the call to both find Christ in my own suffering and be present with those who are suffering.
I think it makes their story a little more accessible to us.
Absolutely. And I think when you think about how easy it is to keep the saints, the martyrs, locked away, hidden, historical, safe distance from us, right? In some ways, when you actually, when you're asked, as you have asked us to consider these people in their context, in their full humanity, it makes their witness all the more amazing, right? That these were people who chose to engage the sick and the suffering and to risk their own life for the well-being of another.
And I think that can point to, that's why it matters to talk about it today. It's not just as a history lesson to take and pack away.
Yeah.
It's a way to look towards our own, to look towards the future.
Yeah.
And see how what people have done in the past, what these women and men did, is a lesson we can take as we encounter these things in our own futures.
That's right.
In our collective futures.
That's right. To be invited to move our thinking away from martyrdom as persecution, right? That the world is out to get us more to be a witness to suffering.
And there's plenty of suffering that we can witness.
100%.
And not witness in a passive way, but witness in an active, loving kindness.
Yeah,
way.
right. Yeah, to actually fully, deeply engage with the world and the suffering that we see. I'd commend the Caroline's talk. Caroline, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time, and I would say stay tuned for more content like this. Caroline will continue to pull the levers behind the curtain.
With pleasure.
Well, I appreciate it.